What's the next conversation? When does it begin? First of all, the Europeans need to produce negotiating guidelines and directives. How long will that take them? They could do it quickly. They may take a little longer over it, partly because we haven't made up our minds what we want, and partly because there are elements of the European side who wish to, as it were, prolong the uncertainty, to, as they say in Brussels, shake the tree.
Right.
And so there will be a discussion about how quickly a transition deal gets in place. We want it quickly. The value of it, as Hammond said, is a diminishing asset. The longer you wait for transition, the more companies are going to say, do you know what, I'm not going to hang around for this. I'm going to activate my contingency plan, relocate
So what happens
staff.
between now and March then? Or from the end of after the European Council to March?
So depending on how long these steps take, the European Council will produce some guidelines, and that will generate then a mandate from Michel Barnier, the chief negotiator. That could take something like a month or more, and then there will be a discussion about the transition. Do we accept ECJ jurisdiction? Do we pay...
So is that January, February time?
We're talking January, February time. And then we get into a broader discussion about Ireland and about the future relationship.
And what happens after March then? What's the March?
Well,
March
we will then get into the meat of what the future looks like.
Right.
Assuming that Mrs May has managed to decide what she wants without blowing up Westminster and the Cabinet and all the rest of it.
So the big focus is what is her end state vision
Yeah.
for the EU. And the problem we've had throughout the whole thing, for all your colleagues or the people you know in Whitehall, is what does the PM want from the future? And no one is clear. Her cabinet is not even clear what she wants.
Well, what she wants is to have her cake and eat it. She wants a deep and special partnership. Now, this is where the problem comes in. In the Florence speech, Mrs May said, look, the Norway arrangement, where you accept free movement, pay into the budget and become a rule taker, ain't going to fly. The people aren't going to accept that. But the Canada arrangement, which is a pretty limited free trade deal that covers goods. Remember, Canada's a long way from the European
So not
Union.
services, crucially.
Well, there are some elements of services
some.
in Canada, but not, as Mrs May said in her Florence speech, nothing like what you would need to wrap up the deep and comprehensive trading relationship that Britain already has. 43% of our exports, 12% of our economic output reliant on trade with Europe. In order to replicate that, we need a deep and special partnership. Now here comes the rub. If we want that, if we want more than what has been called Canada Dry, if we want more than Canada Dry, we are going to have to accept a large amount of EU regular alignment, this phrase everyone's hearing, right? The EU is not going to allow us to diverge, to seek competitive advantage on tax, on regulation, on environmental standards, without cost. It will use the fact that it's important to our trading relationship, as it were, to leverage that weight it has against us to make us think very hard before we diverge. Brexiteers want a free trading relationship. The EU will go, fine, you can have whatever.
And that is going to be very, very naughty, essentially.
It is going to be very naughty because I think we still feel that the EU ought to be more flexible. Yeah. They ought to give us more leeway. Yeah. They just say, no, that's a roundabout way of saying, you want your cake and eat it.
This is the 15-page document that was agreed last night and then published this morning on the government website and in Brussels. Do you think it's a good document? Is it a rush job? Do you worry about it? Because it was, like all these negotiations, they come in a big rush at the end. I mean, you've been through it now. What's your take on it?
I think it is, it's a compromise document. There are some things which are parked. The big question,
such as what, the Irish border?
Take the Irish border question. On the one level, we agree that in the absence of other solutions, we will keep Northern Ireland aligned, and Northern Ireland will stay aligned. But that gives us space now to make the case for another arrangement. Now, we've said, we believe, if you square off on agriculture and electricity, that should be the basis of a very invisible, low visibility border. The European Commission and the Irish are frankly very sceptical of that. Now, if Mrs May decides we're leaving the customs union, we are leaving the single market, as she said that we had, and that you interpret that as a significant divergence for the EU, for the UK from the EU going forward, it is absolutely clear that the European Commission and the Irish and the 27 believe it will be very difficult to solve the Irish border question with option one, which is alignment. Option 2 is technology. Where do you get to? Option 3, which is, of course, what the DUP
border in the
can't
Irish
stomach.
Sea.
A border in the Irish Sea.
So it looks like the Irish question, which we thought on previous podcasts was insoluble, remains insoluble in this document.
Absolutely. What you've done is this is a fix. So what it's done is it's kicked it forward, and the hope, I think, on both sides is that once you get out of the politics, the constitutional threat to the United Kingdom, that you can, as it were, submerge this in a regulatory, technical, policy conversation that makes some of it go away. It's worth noting one thing. The Ireland discussion has maintained its discrete track in this negotiation. So one of the things the Irish were very worried about was that when we got into the nitty-gritty of a big trade deal, the other 26 EU states would go, look, I know you're worried about your border, but frankly, it's time to move on. And by keeping this discrete track, this separate track for Ireland, they will, I think, keep the issue very much alive. And if Mrs May goes for a non-aligned model, then it's going to be tricky. Sure, these things, the demons are not... The demons are just put back in the box.
I'm hearing the Eurosceptic voices in my head, of which there are many, concerned about, I think, about this idea of an agricultural sectoral deal. Because if we do that for all of the UK, that means we can't do an agricultural deal with the US or beef deal with Australia, for example.
Yeah, I mean, again, these are the choices that lay down the line. People will tell you, well, we could do a different kind of trade deal. Trust me, the first thing that goes on the table in a negotiation with the United States is agriculture. Wilbur Ross, when he was here, was saying, you guys need to choose. Do you want to lower the barriers that keep chlorinated chicken, genetically modified foodstuffs, hormone-raised beef out of your markets? If you do, we're not going to make a choice. But Mr. Barnier says exactly the same thing.
Right.
If you want to deal with us, if you want a deal that, you can... that keeps your interests alive, you're going to have to choose.
Arnie Foster says in here that she got 6 changes in her phone calls with Theresa May on Thursday night at 9 p.m. and 11 p.m. And the deal was done before midnight, we're told, by number 10. What do you think the changes are in here? And you're familiar with the draft document that we shared on Monday, aren't you?
Paragraph 50 is what she got.
Right, OK.
Which is a fat para of reassurances. And the question will be, what are those reassurances worth when we get down to the nitty-gritty?
And really, this isn't really helping us deal with the problem. It's more just setting out what the problem is.
Yeah, I mean, so again, this is all about buying time. When we get down the line, will the DUP be holding the balance of power in Westminster? When we get down the line, there is already an east-west border, right, that monitors things like fertiliser and some agri-products. Will that start to expand its scope and remit in order to deal with divergence in the United Kingdom? Never! Yes. Mrs. Arlene Foster will say, but in practice, where do we end up? And we're talking about a trade deal that probably won't be concluded until, I don't know, 2023, 2024, whatever they tell you. No one's going to admit to that. But trust me, if trade deals are done under 207, 208, and 218, those are all
numbers to me, but they are what? Schedules?
The articles of the Treaty of the European Union under which the trade deal is done. Once you get into that iterative EU trade process...
It takes as long as it takes.
It takes a long time. It's not... This is really deeply
So away from Ireland, we're looking at sovereignty. That's another big issue, isn't it? And number 10 this morning playing down the issue of British courts referring to the European Court of Justice on some key areas on EU citizen rights. They say it happens 2 or 3 times a year. Nothing to see here. Are you happy with that?
I think people need to understand exactly what we're talking about here. The rights of the EU citizens, the 3.2 million, are founded on EU rules and regulations. Just as we don't want the European Court of Justice to be making UK law, the Europeans are very keen, adamant indeed, that the judgments of the UK Supreme Court should not create EU case law. Okay? And this is a way of finessing that. One of the things that's interesting is that we agreed to take the withdrawal agreement and write it directly into UK law. But if you read the documents carefully, there is nothing in those documents that stops sovereign parliament from repealing the entire thing. Now, that was one of the considerations for the EU. How would you stop a future UK government repealing it? That piece of sovereignty has been retained. I am aware that Eurosceptics are concerned, and they are concerned not without good reason, that when we go forward, this will be a Trojan horse for further demands for the European Court of Justice to have, via whichever dispute resolution mechanism we come up with, to have further say over things like Euratom, over things like trade and convergence and standards. And
so there might be a creeping land grab by the ECJ. That's a concern.
Well, I think what you will discover, and what we're going to discover after Christmas, is that if the UK wants a non-disruptive, deep and special trade partnership, there are going to have to be a lot of trade-offs, and the scope and reach of the European Court of Justice is going to be among them.
Do you worry about the idea of two classes of citizen after Brexit? So those who've got EU rights enshrined by the ECJ and Brits who haven't? It
is interesting. If you look at the two documents here, one is the joint report. So that's Sabine Wayand and Ollie Robbins, the two chief officials.
That's this one.
That's this one. There is another document, which is the European Commission's glossing of this main document. And if you read that document carefully, it's an interesting one. One of the things it talks about is what will you do about what they call third country spouses. Right now, it is harder for a British citizen to bring a non-EU spouse into the country than is a European citizen. That issue has not been resolved. And what's interesting is, when we talk about the rights in the future for someone to bring a non-EU spouse, it says the European Commission believes that future spouses ought to be able to be brought in. And we don't agree that, but it says it's to be negotiated in phase 2, and it will be linked. It's explicit in the document. It will be linked to the extent to which the UK wants a deep and special relationship. And so this is the problem we're going to have. There are going to be things in there we don't want, and every time we say we don't want them, the Europeans are going to say, well, in that case, we can't really help you on financial services. We can't really help you on...
It's negotiation. It's been a long 18 months to get here, hasn't it? But we are here. Will it get easier or harder now?
Harder. Yeah, this was the easy part, I think. That's what I think people... everyone's jubilant and exhausted. And frankly, the best thing that everyone can happen is we can go to the European Council next week, bish, bosh, stamp, everyone go home for Christmas and have a deep breath. The next conversation is going to be a tricky one, because the decision that the British government makes about how closely we want to remain aligned with the European Union will define Brexit means Brexit. That question, the answer to that question, will define what Brexit actually means. And when you, as we saw with with a little flash, what you saw was a little lacuna into the future in the fight you saw over Ireland. When these hypothetical things start to get into, well, in that case, my business is not going to be able to trade. In that case, we're going to need.
So this doesn't mean the deal is done. The deal doesn't mean we're not going to leave on WTO terms, which is what everyone fears. This so-called cliff edge. These things are still in play.
I think they're still in play, but I think it's also important to say that this is a major step, because I think once you've got these three, well, certainly two, I think, money and citizens' big housekeeping issues out the way, the hope is, I think, everybody settles down. The European Union's got their money, which they were very exercised about. The rights of the citizens on both sides of the channel sorted, pretty much. Ireland, a time bomb waiting to go off, but if handled correctly, if Dublin is frankly a bit less aggressive, and the Europeans understand the constitutional implications of them being very aggressive, and everyone is genuinely imaginative in their solutions, then I think it is possible to get towards a deal and I think the likelihood is of a deal. I think the problem is going to be here. The problem is going to be when the Europeans start to make very clear what the consequences of for what you want to call it, a Boris and Gove Brexit is. A Brexiteer's Brexit, a hard Brexit. You know, when that penny drops, we will have to see the ripples that come out in Parliament, in public opinion.
Wow.
And that's why Mrs. May has not had the conversation, because it's going to be a difficult one. If it was easy, she'd have done it.